Welcome to Season 2 of Nuances Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora. Together, we wanted to create a safe space where everyone can learn more about our diverse communities, the complicated relationships we have with our culture, and how they intersect with feminism, queerness, disability, anti-racism, career choices, politics, and more.
I'm Ariadne Mila, a Filipino-American from a small town on the southern border of Texas.
And I'm Sherilyn Lee, aka Lazu, a new American originally from the only place a dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. Being gaslit means being manipulated into questioning your own sanity using psychological methods. It comes from a 1944 movie called Gaslight. DMs stands for direct message, which is a chat feature on Instagram and other social media platforms.
Jess Pillay is an Indo-Fijian-American independent singer-songwriter and podcaster from the Pacific Northwest. Growing up in Seattle with Indo-Fijian roots, she spent most of her life feeling like a cultural orphan, but music gave her a sense of identity and purpose. Now in her 30s, she's deeply passionate about racial and gender equity and always looks for ways to explore these subjects through her creative work. Her goal is to use her art to create community and to help others find their own voices. Jess, thanks so much for hanging with us today. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Why don't we start with you giving us a little history of how your family ended up in Seattle, coming from Fiji, and then beyond that from India?
Yeah, there's so many layers to that question every time I get asked it, but I'm happy to share. So I am Indo-Fijian, which means Indian by blood, fully Indian, but have roots in Fiji because of colonialism and the British colonizing Fiji at one point and bringing Indians over to be indentured laborers. So a couple generations back in my family on both sides, they were brought over, my great-grandparents and whatnot were brought over to work in the indentured labor system, working in the sugarcane plantations in Fiji. I have always felt a little bit like a cultural orphan because we don't really know what parts of India our family's even from. So I'm sure we still have extended family several degrees removed that are in India, but we've never had contact with them. We don't even know how to contact them at this point. And so the culture that my parents really grew up with was Fijian culture, but the Indian culture that had morphed and evolved over time in Fiji. And then in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of tension between the indigenous Fijian population and the government and the Indian population that was in Fiji. And so a lot of them decided, we're just going to leave. We can't survive here, but we can't really go back to India because it's been such a long time. We don't really know where to go. So let's just try to go wherever else we can, where maybe there's opportunity and a chance to start over with our families. So my dad's side of the family came to Seattle. To be completely honest, I don't know why they picked Seattle. I think part of it was pretty close to Vancouver, and there's a decently large population of Indians in Vancouver, and I think we had some extended family up there. Coming to the US just made sense, and being close to Vancouver made sense. So my dad's family came over in the 70s, and then my parents actually had an arranged marriage and met through my mother's dad. So he sent her off in the early 80s. And yeah, so that's kind of how my parents ended up in Seattle. I was actually born and raised here as well as my two younger brothers. So we've always lived in the Pacific Northwest. We're very true Seattleites in a lot of ways.
Do your parents speak any Indian language at all, or is English their first language?
When I was growing up, we spoke what we call Fiji Hindi, which is Hindi, but it's got its own little regional influence. Because again, going back to British colonization, they pulled all these different Indian people from different regions. And of course, India has hundreds of different languages. You know, they dumped them in Fiji and then expected them to know how to communicate with each other. So I think there were quite a few Hindi speakers, but over time, there were all these other regional languages like Tamil and some of the South Indian languages that all got mixed in there as well. So Fiji Hindi is kind of its own thing. And I've heard somebody compare it to Afrikaans. It's got like its own sort of dialect. I grew up watching a lot of Hindi movies, Bollywood movies as well, so I can fully understand Hindi. I don't have to use subtitles. I can understand it, but the version of Hindi that we grew up speaking is slightly different. So if you put me in front of an actual Indian from India and say, go have a conversation, that's not going to happen very easily because the grammar and just the way that our dialect works is different.
Growing up, have you felt any tension between the Indian identity and culture versus whatever was normal in Seattle for a kid there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up in this environment where there was this cultural religious war happening right within my home, because you had dad's side of the family that was so devoutly Hindu, and then mom who's strong and determined that I'm going to raise my children as Christians, because that's what really saved her life in a lot of ways. My mom actually became a born again Christian when she was in elementary school. And so she put us in Christian school as well, my brothers and I. So we ended up in these very predominantly white Christian spaces. And that actually shaped my identity a lot more than the Hindu side. But I was always exposed to both. A lot of Hindu people have this mindset that all religions kind of lead to the same place, enlightenment. And there's not really this tension. But I think in our family, there was a tension because there was this mindset that Christianity is white people's religion. So why are you adopting this thing and rejecting your culture? And then here's my mom. She grew up in a pretty dysfunctional household. And then her marriage was rough too, because she married a stranger. She found her safety, security in the church. That's where my mom found community. And unfortunately, it was a predominantly white environment. So with that, I had a good childhood in a lot of ways, and then some not so good things that happened in my childhood. But I think the Christian church really did become a place of safety for me. And then I would go be with my family where there was more of that Hindu influence. And this is not a critique against Hinduism. It's more a critique against my own family in some ways, but there was a lot of dysfunction. So I think I started to, as a child, make this association. Hinduism is not good. Christianity is better. And grew up with that. And then realized many years later that, wow, there's so much of my culture that I lost because we were so siloed and focused on staying within these Christian environments. And it forced me, without even realizing it, to really assimilate to the way that the white Christian community that I was a part of functioned, because that was the way that I knew how to survive. I'm technically not mixed race. I'm fully Indian, but I've always had this affinity with mixed race individuals because I've grown up my whole life juggling these three cultures and never really fully feeling a part of any one of them. When the Indian population in Seattle started to grow, because Seattle is becoming more and more of a tech hub, I started to have more interaction with people from India and then realized very quickly, wow, they do not understand Indo-Fijians. And it's a whole different dynamic because they don't really accept us, my family, or my siblings. And in our case, there's these layers of, okay, you sound like white people, you've got American accents and you're Indian, so they'll ask, what part of India are you from? And right away we're like, we don't know because we're Indo-Fijian. And then they're like mad at us. There's kind of some tension there. So there's always been that I've had to navigate. And then on top of that, growing up in Seattle, where there's also a lot of white people here, having to navigate that piece and never really feeling like I fully fit in with that crowd either. Every time I've worked to take my own identity back and grow some roots within my Indianness or my Indo-Fijian-ness, then there's this sense of feeling isolated or alienated from the white community that I grew up with. And I'm not mixed race, but I often feel like I am in some ways because I have these three things that I'm constantly having to juggle. And it's a struggle constantly. I never really know where I fit in. So I've very recently started using that language of Indo-Fijian-American because it's the closest thing I can think of that really captures all of these three cultures. But I didn't grow up in Fiji either. So there's that sense of a little bit of imposter syndrome when I say Indo-Fijian, because I'm like, well, I wasn't raised there. My parents were. But so I think becoming a creative and becoming a musician has helped in a lot of ways because it's given me a space to process some of that stuff. I wrote this song that's called Telling You the Truth. It's about that question of being asked, where are you from? It's such a simple question and we all get it, but we all get triggered by it often because it's really a complicated question to answer. And people who have not gone through that experience don't understand that, it's not this simply curious question that you're asking. There are multiple layers to that question that in some of our cases can actually drudge up a lot of hurt and trauma and memories of some horrible things that have happened. Because when you ask me that question, I'm thinking now about colonization and I'm thinking about what happened to my ancestors. And then I'm thinking about my parents' relationship and my mom essentially being forced to come to the United States. I'm grateful that I grew up in the US, but there's a lot of layers to ending up here in the first place. When someone says, "Where are you from?" and you say, "I'm from Seattle." That's the answer I've just started giving people. I don't elaborate. I used to go through this space of having to elaborate and explain to people because I felt like I had something to prove. And I finally just got to this point a few years ago where I said, wait a minute. The actual honest answer is I'm from Seattle. That's literally what's on my birth certificate. It's where I was born. So if you want to know where I'm from, that's where I'm from. So I'll tell people that. And then, of course, the response is, well, where are you really from?
Yeah.
I just told you. I just told you. So then they go, well, where are your parents from? And again, it's like, what is this, 20 questions? I don't want to play this game with you and explain British colonization and the history of Indians ending up in Fiji and all of that. So I wrote this song that's this tongue-in-cheek, snarky pop song that essentially is about that question. And it was interesting when I put that song out. I have an email list that I'll occasionally send stuff out to fans. And that was the first time I got a bunch of unsubscriptions. People unsubscribed after I put out a little blurb about that song, where it came from. Every other song that I've promoted, I didn't have anybody unsubscribe. It's fascinating to me that when I wrote a little blurb about this microaggression idea and why I felt compelled to write this song, suddenly people are like, that's not for me. And they're abandoning ship. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I find it very annoying if you're going to a professional event, like a networking event in music industry, and then you're faced with this question and you're like, why am I having an identity crisis in front of this stranger when all I want to do is talk about music and find people to collaborate with or just meet people to talk about music? Why is that the first question? Does the answer influence what you think of me or whether you want to work with me? What is that about?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's fine if you're asking and then you say Seattle and they're like, oh, cool. But when they dig deeper, and also it's the way they ask. Like if they said, did you grow up here? Then that means they can envision somebody who looks like you growing up here and being native here. That's totally fine. But if they say, where you're really from, like, where are your ancestors from? It's like, okay, this is giving very racist vibes.
Exactly.
Where are your ancestors from?
Exactly.
You mentioned growing up in the church. Did you feel completely embraced by the religious community around you, or did you still feel like you were different?
Religiously, I was accepted because I was a Christian and that's what my family was. We were very involved in our church, but culturally, definitely not. When I was in elementary school, I had to be probably 9 or 10. We had some kind of a cultural night where you brought food and wore your traditional clothing and all that and brought it to your school, presented it to this group. So it was my turn to do that and to bring some stuff from my culture. And I was really excited because I grew up being very proud of my culture and I loved the food, I loved the clothing, I loved the music, all of that stuff. And so I was very proud of it. So my mom made this dish. It's a dessert dish that's called kheer. It's a rice pudding and it has cardamom and cloves and all these aromatic flavors in it. This was in the 90s in a very white Christian school where these kids probably had never been exposed to these flavors and these kinds of dishes. I remember my mom working so hard making this dish, putting all her love and energy into the experience. She loves cooking and food is her love language, basically, and she loves preparing. She used to love hosting people at her house and things like that. So we took all this kheer to the cultural night. And I watched almost every child in that room take a bite and then throw the whole bowl in the trash because they didn't like it. And it was such a scarring experience for me as a child. And that idea started to then be planted in my head that there's something wrong with my culture. There's something wrong with my food. And I've heard a lot of my other Asian friends talk about not wanting to bring food to the cafeteria because it smells different. So it was like, don't give me Indian food. I don't want to bring Indian food to school. I'm going to just eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which is not as cool. And it took a long time to really reclaim that sense of identity that was connected to food, because as a young child, this idea was planted in my head that your food, your culture, your traditions are somehow less than. Or I remember even friends coming over to my house and my parents always spoke to each other in Hindi. They just didn't even bother speaking to each other in English at that time and mostly spoke to us, the kids, in Hindi as well. well, then you get your friends saying, what are they saying? What are they saying? And there's almost this attitude or this tone behind it of what's wrong with them? Why are they speaking in another language? And so I have these memories from growing up where I do feel like my culture was rejected, and it took me a really long time. It wasn't until my maybe late teens, early 20s that I really started to say, you know what, I'm proud of who I am and I don't need to be ashamed of it. And also, it's been a little bit triggering in some ways because I feel like all of a sudden with chai tea and all the stuff that's made this appearance in America and in the West, all of a sudden everybody's wanting the cardamom and the cloves and all these things that I literally watched my classmates dump into a trash can. It's been hard to find that balance and to not feel hurt by it and to process and heal from some of that stuff, because I definitely have pockets where I was not accepted and I had to work really hard to feel comfortable in my own skin and to feel a sense of pride for my own culture.
Did you have any friends that you were able to share that with, or did you have to carry that on your own?
I mostly carried it on my own because the school that I went to was very white. So we had maybe a handful of people from different countries and cultures, but predominantly white. And, my way of fitting in was just to assimilate and to reject who I actually was. It really wasn't until my brothers got older, we started to really have these conversations, and then talking to some of our cousins and then realizing, wow, we're really unique and special, and this is something to be really proud of. But I spent many years just feeling very alone and compartmentalizing. The Jess that was at home was very different from the Jess that was out in the world and in the community, because I just felt like I had to constantly make that switch in order to survive and fit in.
Yeah.
That's rough. Yeah, it always makes me uncomfortable when I see all the cultural appropriation that's happening, especially of Indian culture, like goat yoga.
Totally. I had to call out one of my friends that I grew up with because she is doing a lot of wellness and health content on hers. And she posted something about this trend called golden milk. We call it haldi doodh, which is what it translates to. That's the Hindi phrase for it. And it's turmeric with milk and a couple other anti-inflammatory things that you make into this drink. She's a white woman and she's talking about it as if it's this revolutionary new thing. And I'm like, do you know how long Indians have been using this? I grew up with my grandma making it for us. You go talk to any Indian person, they'll say when you have a cold or when you're dealing with inflammation, it's a common household cure. And all of a sudden, now you've got the white community talking about it. Or my mom and I joke about this one a lot. Ghee, which is clarified butter, which of course the white people say ghee. It's actually ghee, which is how you, the H is not silent. And it's everywhere. So my mom was actually complaining one day because she said, now I go to the Indian grocery store around here and the prices are all jacked up because the white people have discovered it. So the Indian grocery sellers have realized, oh, if we raise the price, we can make a larger profit off of this. So now the Indian people are like, hey, hang on a minute. This used to be a really cheap product. And now because white people discovered it, we suddenly have to pay double the price. That's not fair.
Yeah, we want the Indian price.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, white people make everything more expensive. In Vogue magazine, this white designer created these towels and rugs made out of t-shirts that she ripped up and wove together.
Okay.
And called a basahan, and Filipino families use that as rugs, and Latino families use that in their household for generations. And it's just so funny because this designer was selling them for $200 a piece, and that was literally a thing that Filipinos and Latinos did out of poverty because
yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And then they call it like it's such an eco-friendly creative thing. But we've been doing that and we did it because of poverty.
Gentrifying our food and our other things.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's wild to me.
That friend that you called out, was it a good friend?
Yeah, we grew up together. We actually have known each other since kindergarten. So I messaged her and said, hey, just so you know, you might want to change your caption. This is not a trend. This is actually something that has been around for centuries. Indian people have been doing it forever. And I'm sure other South Asians too, not just Indians. And it's hurtful to see you present it this way. And then she did message me back and she said, okay, I hear what you're saying. I didn't realize that's how it came across. In the communities that I'm a part of, it is this trending thing in the way that it's talked about. I just didn't even know. So she went back and actually changed the caption, and we are still friends to this day. And she messaged me and said, I never want to appropriate or do anything that's disrespecting your culture, but I also don't want to make it your burden to teach me. She said, I really appreciate that you did call me out, and I'm willing to hear anything it is that you want to share about this stuff, but please know that I will do better and go and do my research, try to learn so that it's not your burden to carry. So we're good.
That's cool.
Yeah.
If it's somebody that I'm close to, I would have no problem calling them out.
Yeah.
But the tricky part is people that I know in the music context, I'm not really good friends with them. We've interacted on music related things, but then I see them posting something that is clearly a cultural appropriation of Chinese culture.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do because I feel like I'm not close enough to them to do that. And I don't know if I should or not.
I know. I've wrestled with that idea a lot over the years. And 5 or 6 years ago, I got really into this headspace about racial equity and racial justice and just claiming back my own identity and watching the other people around me. My best friend is Latina, and we both went through this journey together of really reclaiming our identities as women of color. And part of that came with, okay, what do we say? When do we say it? Who do we say things to? And initially, anybody I could call out, I was calling them out. I was just like going full on in. And then ending up in these stupid arguments with people because they weren't receptive or didn't want to hear what I had to say. So then I did this flip and I got to a point where I just decided, I'm not going to do that anymore. I have to protect myself and my own boundaries. I'll talk about it with people who genuinely have curiosity and want to hear what I have to say, but I'm not going to always put myself in that position of educating people or even asking those questions. There's enough racism to go around and there will always be those issues. But what I actually started to do is I started talking to my white friends who I consider allies and said, y'all need to call each other out. You take it on yourself. I'm not going to do it anymore because it's a lot more burdensome and harmful to me to be the one to call people out. You know, if you see something or if I see something and I tell you about it and you happen to know those people, I'm going to encourage you to go and actively call it out. And it's really interesting. You start to see who your true allies are in that experience because there's a lot of folks who will say, I'm totally committed to racial equity. I'm totally committed to racial justice. I really want to be a good ally. But then when the rubber meets the road and there's actually an opportunity in front of them to call their own peers out, they don't want to do it. The other thing that I have found to be really important in my own life is calling out internalized racism and the layers of racism that exist in our own communities. For example, when everything happened in 2020, suddenly the struggle for the Black community was such a prominent part of the conversation that was happening in our culture. I started to do a lot of reflecting on what that looked like for me as an Asian person, because I'm sure you both relate to this. Asians have often been stereotyped as model minority, and we've figured out ways to assimilate differently than I think the Black population has. And it's been harmful to the Black community because of decisions. And we probably didn't do it, of course, with the intention of harming the Black community. We did it because we were just trying to survive in our own communities and against white supremacy, really. But we inherently caused harm. And so for me, you know, calling out things like colorism in my own family and having conversations with my mom about that, because I remember even growing up, especially Bollywood is very internally racist. You will always see the more fair-skinned, more European-looking women getting the roles, and darker-skinned folks just get left by the wayside. There's not room for them. Or you have $1 billion some industry for skin lightening products in Bollywood. You have these big celebrities like Shah Rukh Khan. He's one of the biggest Bollywood celebrities out there. He's endorsed these products in the past. And so now you've got Indian people in India and part of the Indian diaspora who are all going and paying to have these really harmful chemicals put on their skin because they want to be lighter. So things like that. I've started calling that stuff out even within my own Asian and Indian community and saying, we got to address this because we can't truly be committed to racial equity if we're not calling it out amongst ourselves. Let white people call it out among their own population. I'm not going to deal with that anymore. If a white friend or an ally or somebody that, like you said, has that relationship with you and asks those questions, then yes, 100%. I'm willing to have those conversations. But I've just become a lot more aware and cognizant of my own boundaries and recognized that I can't continue this work actively if I'm running around calling everybody out or trying to create change in spaces where I'm not accepted to begin with.
Yeah.
They're not going to listen to me. So I just try to do my thing and focus on the people that I can have change with and leave everybody else to their own issue.
One other thing that I know is very near and dear to your heart is feminism. When it comes to Asian culture and feminism, there is definitely a clash with Asian culture and feminism a lot of times. What has been your experience?
That has always been my experience. Women being told, sit down, shut up. You don't get to have a voice in this. You have to do what your husband says or your father, whoever, And so I'll give you a very specific example. So I used to work in higher education. I was an admissions counselor for a long time. So I used to recruit students to an MBA program. I would get these couples that would come visit me and inquire about our program, and it would be a husband and a wife, an Indian couple. The wife would be the one interested in the program. So I would sit down and have, conversation and say, okay, tell me about your goals. What do you want to do with your MBA? And the husband would answer, and she would just not even speak. And I'm like, you're about to enroll in a graduate program. I need to at least have a conversation with you and see if this is a good fit. I don't think she thought she was doing anything wrong. And this happened multiple times with multiple different couples. And I started to realize, man, my family was the oddball. We defied a lot of those because I had very strong women in my family. And I think that's where that desire or passion for feminism came from. When I think of the strongest person in my family, I think of my maternal grandmother. She was fierce, strong, very, very centered in who she was and knew what her values were, didn't really let anybody affect those things. She had a really hard life and she became this very strong, independent woman. And yet a lot of times that's not a true reflection of what you see in Indian communities, especially at the time that my mom was growing up and my grandma's time, they weren't allowed to have a voice. And then for me, being raised in America where feminism is a lot of times more of a value. And I mean, we certainly have patriarchal issues here too, not to say that they don't exist because they definitely do. But I was around other strong women and got to see people who maybe were outside of my own cultural group that I came to really love and respect and admire, who were really strong, knew how to take back their voice and knew how to affect change in their communities. So it started to really grow in me. I think there's always benefits gained and benefits lost from being a person of color growing up in a predominantly white society. And for me, one of the benefits gained, I think, is the fact that I was exposed to feminist ideas. But I will say this. I think that feminism in America is white feminism most of the time. The standard mainstream version of feminism that we all interact with on the day-to-day is created for, by, and with white women in mind. So there's been a lot of times in my own life, especially in the last 10 years, where I'm like, I consider myself a feminist, and yet there are certain values that white women have that just don't work for me. I still am very Indian, Indo-Fijian in the sense that collectiveness that our cultures have matters. So this idea of just being an individual, not giving a crap about what anybody around me thinks, that's not how I was raised. My parents didn't raise me. My grandmother didn't raise me like that. So there is still this tension that exists because as much as I value feminism, it looks really different for me than it does for a lot of the feminists in my life who are thinking about it more from that white feminist perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very Sheryl Sandberg lean in feminism. Women just need to be more assertive. And I think even Sheryl, after she wrote that book, she backtracked and said, I was actually wrong about all of that stuff. But that is what I think of white feminism is women need to be more like white men. Yeah.
I'd love to know, what does being an ally look like to you?
For me, it really goes back to respecting my boundaries, doing work that is not performative, and actually putting your money where your mouth is, looking for ways to actually advance these causes. My buddy Sam, he's a great example of an ally in my life because he's a white man, educated, super smart, super generous, definitely recognizes his privilege, and also really understands consent. And so every time we've had conversations, he's always, okay, I have this question about something that I want to know, but are you comfortable talking about it? I'm not going to feel the sense of entitlement that I think a lot of times white people have, even people who want to be good allies, but they just think because my intentions are good, because I want to be an ally, I'm now entitled to your trauma and the hard things that you've gone through. And I'm just going to ask you to divulge all of that and talk about it. And we're sitting here going, do you realize what you're stirring up in us when you ask us some of these questions? Sam is a great example of somebody who has done his own homework and understands when he asks questions what that might be doing for me, and really goes out of his way when it comes to white people calling out white people. He's so good at it. He'll get into these discussions with people on social media sometimes. I'll read through some of his posts and I'm just like, yes, thank you for taking the burden off of me so that I don't have to say this stuff. And you're doing it so well. Calling out his own peers and making a point to always educate himself as much as he can. That to me is a prime example of a really great ally. Glad to have him in my life.
Another thing that we wanted to touch on was how sometimes your relationship with religion can be hurtful when it comes to mental health. A lot of people who are religious have a very hard time accepting mental health help. It's so frustrating to me when I try to talk to them and they're like, I don't need anything, I have God. So I was wondering if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. I've gone through some rough mental health experiences in my own life. I grew up in the church. Depression, anxiety, none of these things were talked about. And if they were, it was that same idea, like you said, I have God. I don't need therapy. I don't need this. There's a scripture that says, like, do not be anxious about anything. And so I grew up with that rhetoric and the insinuation that if you're struggling with your mental health, it means you're not a good Christian. It means you're not praying hard enough. It means you're not committed or involved enough in your church community, whatever. I don't think any of those people that gave me that kind of advice did it with any malicious intent. I think it was well-meaning. It was just what they knew. And yet I went through an experience where I fell into a very dark pit and what I now would call clinical depression and anxiety. Got to the point where I was having suicidal tendencies and this massive identity and faith crisis. Walked away from church and decided, I don't know if I believe in God. I don't know if I believe in any of these values that I had been raised, because if God is really there and if he cares about me as much as I've been told, why is he allowing me to go through this experience that I'm in? And I remember even my grandma and my mom, their response was, we got to pray for you. Let's pray for you. We'll pray away this depression and anxiety that you're dealing with. Nobody at any point in that time said to me, maybe we should put you in counseling or therapy or take you to the doctor or see if there's something else clinically that's causing you to have these emotions and experiences. I started to go to therapy after my parents split up and after my grandma had passed away, because I initially went to therapy just to process my grief. And I didn't know how to do that because that was another thing, that the church is not good when it comes to talking about grief. It's just, oh, they're in heaven. It's fine. You'll see them again. Move on, have joy, be happy kind of messaging. And that's not how I feel. So I started seeing a therapist, and she was the first person who really said, I want to give you space to grieve, and I want to give you space to process anger, all of the emotions that you're feeling. And there's no timeline for this. It's not like you're going to go through 8 sessions with me and suddenly you're going to not be grieving anymore. The grief still comes up even now, years later. I still experience it at times. I'm in a much better place now, and my relationship with the church has certainly changed, but going to therapy then is really what got me to a place where I could say, I still believe in God, I still believe in Jesus, I still have faith. This does mean something to me. It's an important part of who I am, but I don't look to the church really or to the religious community to help me process my mental health. That stuff is happening in therapy, that stuff is happening in other spaces in my life. Therapy really works, so I'm a huge advocate of that. Therapy can help you know who you are and learn how to process a lot of these emotions that not just religious society, but society at large doesn't equip us to deal with. And it saved my life in a lot of ways. My best friend is a therapist and also a Christian. I love the approach that she takes with her clients, which is if you disclose that you're a faith-based person and you want to incorporate those values into your counseling, I will do that. And if you don't disclose that to me and that's not something that you want, we don't have to go there. So it gives people that opportunity to really consent into it and decide how much of the faith piece do I want brought into my therapy work.
Yeah, that's a really great point to make. I think people who have never gone to therapy think that therapy, that it's entirely just science and you're going to negate everything that you learn in the church. And what you're saying is that that's actually not the case. Mm-hmm. And a lot of therapists are actually also Christians, and they can help you weave through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to your career in music, how has your ethnicity impacted your career?
Yeah, because I grew up in these predominantly white spaces and had spent most of my life pursuing music in a church capacity, I didn't feel like I was out of place at all. I thought I fit right in. I'm going to do the music ministry thing. I'm going to go off and be a worship director at a church somewhere, and everything was great. And then I had this massive identity and faith crisis and went, maybe that's not the way I want to do music, and maybe that's not the right path for me. So when I decided that I was going to pursue music independently and start actually writing my own music, then all of these things started to come to light where I was like, oh, the independent music business works completely differently from everything that I have known before that in the church community and in religious music. I, at one point, was looking for like an artist development coach or someone to help me navigate more of the business side of the music industry. This guy that I knew, I had been a fan of a band that he used to be a part of years and years ago. He was starting a coaching practice, and we somehow ended up talking to each other through DMs and then on an actual Zoom exploratory call. And I was saying, I know you do more life coaching, but you've also got this music background and I'm trying to grow that. Maybe we could work together because I really need someone who has music experience in the industry. He was on this label and all this stuff. So I thought he's got some experience that he can probably help me navigate. At that time, I was working a 40-hour-a-week job, doing music as a side hustle, and had no real intention of quitting my job because I wasn't financially in a place yet where I could just leave it all and jump full into music. He starts giving me advice, and he says to me, I don't think you really want this as much as you claim you do. And I'm like, bro, really? That's your advice? This is not helping me at all. And I'm like, no, I do. This is what I want to do. And I actually took a big hiatus from music for a while and then came back to it because I realized, no, this is really what I love more than anything. And if I'm going to spend my time doing something professionally, this is it. And it's probably going to look differently for me because I am a woman of color, but this is what I want to do. And he's like, I don't know about that. He was being condescending about it. And basically by the end of the conversation, my takeaway was, I guess I don't really want this. And so I took this to my therapist at the time, who was an Asian American woman. And I said to her, this is what this dude told me, and I'm really confused. And now I don't know. I felt gaslit, really. I think something that women of color especially do is when we get gaslit, we then start to internalize it. And we start asking those questions like, wait, maybe that person was right. Do I not? You start playing this horrible game with yourself, and it is very disorienting. So I'm talking to my therapist about all this. She goes, let me tell you one thing. You're not going to quit your job because you're Asian and Asians like money. I'm like, you know what? You got a point there. And really, it was a joking way of saying we value our stability, especially those of us who came from families where they had to leave everything to come to America and start from scratch. I'm not just going to dishonor that legacy that my parents gave me, essentially. My parents are getting older. I don't know what the future is going to look like for them. I don't want to be that daughter who's a starving artist and can't contribute back to my family and all these things. So just quitting my job did not seem like the reasonable or right thing to do, even when it came to valuing, respecting my family. So then she says, you are navigating a system that was not designed for you. That was that big, bright aha moment for me where I'm like, oh shit. Like, let me go do some research now and see how much of that is true. And as I started to dig into these statistics, I think it was Rolling Stone magazine at one point put out a stat that said the music industry, as far as artists go, 21% are women. And that's just women across the board. So then I'm like, okay, if 21% are women, the number's got to be even smaller, specifically women of color. And so I'm in this teeny tiny little subset of this industry. All the resources, tools, general mainstream advice that's being put out there, so much of it is by white men. So of course they're not thinking about me. I was having a conversation with my friend Sam, who's the editor on my podcast, after you were a guest on my podcast. And I think I asked you a question about what do you say to women of color who might be thinking about making that career shift? And Sam was sitting in the room listening to our conversation as we were recording. And you said something to the effect of crunch the numbers, do the math, figure out when it reasonably makes sense for you to make that transition. And immediately after that recording, Sam said to me, I've never heard anyone give that advice. And I looked at him and I said, she gave the Asian answer. Because it truly was. And for me, it resonated so much because I said, yes, somebody who's giving advice that actually makes sense, that feels realistic, versus all of the dozens of times that I've heard someone say to me, just quit. Life will work itself out. You'll be fine. You just have to hustle. You just have to work hard. Just grind. Grinding isn't going to pay my bills if it's not.
I have some questions. Do people actually do that?
I would love to know myself.
I remember reading an article by Ari Herstand, and I'm a big fan of a lot of stuff that he puts out, but that one really grated me, and something to the effect of, don't get an intellectually difficult job, get a Starbucks job.
Yes, I remember that.
And I remember reading that, and something about it was just, that feels so wrong on so many ways. First of all, it feels like a very extrovert kind of advice, because his whole argument is if you have a job that's demanding on your brain, at the end of the day, you're completely out of energy, you can't create. So get something that's easy. And I was like, Starbucks isn't easy. What the hell are you talking about?
Right.
That's the hardest job on the planet.
Yeah.
For me, it would be anyway.
Yeah.
Dealing with people all day, yelling drinks and trying to remember everybody's name, I would be so confused.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it either.
And not only that, but it would be a lot of Karens. Dealing with Karens all day and then trying to get the energy to go play a gig and write a song. Like, no, it's not going to happen. I'm just going to die and be depressed. And that was the first time that I had read advice on a blog that I normally really liked that felt like, okay, this was not for me.
Yeah.
And also the idea that you should be fine with a job that doesn't pay you very well, that is really hard, that you're on your feet all day, just so you can have supposedly more brain power. But what about the idea of having a high-paying job that is funding your music and
exactly
is giving you more life balance, an actual 9 to 5, and you get benefits and you you get all this time off, you get flight points when you're going on business.
Right.
I just felt like that was such a narrow-minded advice to give.
Yep.
Yeah, to this day, that article just like chafes at my brain. Every time I think about it, it's like, oh, this feels so wrong.
And I think it's in his book that he says at one point, don't take the promotion. And I'm like, why not?
Right.
Like, if the opportunity is there and if you know yourself that you have the bandwidth to do both, do what's right for you. That is horrible advice to give across the board because some people are going to be fine taking that promotion, and maybe that stability, the health benefits, all the things that come with having a high paying job is what's going to actually allow them then to do the creative work. And I actually am a testament of that because I built my entire music career while having a 40-hour-a-week job, and then thought, okay, let me do the 30-hour-a-week job so that I can keep building the music. And actually what ended up happening is I did way less music during that season because that job was not actually compatible with the music work that I was doing. I was in higher ed for almost 10 years, left that job to go work as an administrative coordinator at a tiny little nonprofit. I was sold on this organization because they were very supportive of my music and I wouldn't be spending nearly as much time at my day job, which would then in theory allow me to have more time for my music. It ended up being one of the worst jobs I've ever had. And even though I was working 30 hours a week, first of all, it just was not intellectually stimulating enough for me. I was bored a lot of the times. And on top of that, it was a tiny nonprofit that had a lot of operational issues. And I'm the kind of person that really needs structure and streamlined systems. And I didn't have that. So I'd be in this 30 hours of chaos every week after leaving a job where I had 40 hours of structure. And I suddenly went, you know what? The 40-hour job was better for me because even though it took more time out of my week, I knew how to do it. I had systems in place that allowed me to automate a lot. I could come home at the end of the day, pick up the guitar, sit down at the piano and start writing. And so actually I'm back at a university, but I'm now working in marketing as a content writer. When people ask me, what do you do? I'm still probably going to say I'm a musician, because that's really the job that I identify more with. And it's the thing that I'm trying to build. But having a writing job that's also creative and allows me to work with people who work in roles that are a lot more aligned with the kind of creative work that I'm doing. To anybody listening, or to any other woman of color out there who's in that same position, my advice is do what's right for you. Forget what the white men tell you, because they have a totally different experience and situation, and that advice just may not be right for you. If you need to hold down the 40-hour-a-week job because it's what gives you safety, peace of mind, and the stability that you need, and that allows you to then go and do your creative work, that's what you got to do. That's what I'm doing. So it's going to be the bivocational life for me for probably a while, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I also feel like for your mental health, it's so much better to pick a job that you at least don't hate.
Yeah.
Don't pick a job that you hate just because that's the advice that the industry says you should be doing that will help you advance your career. Because guess what? If you burn out, you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
I know some friends who are super extroverted and who love being in contact with people all day. They've tried the office job and they hated it, and they went back to something more customer facing. If that's what you like, then that makes sense.
Yeah.
But if you're like me and just the idea of talking to people is overwhelming, maybe don't go into retail or Starbucks, because that's going to make you burn out way faster.
That is exactly why I took this marketing gig, because it's writing. So I have days where I don't talk to anybody and I just get to sit and write all day. And I'm like, that is perfect. That any extroverted energy that I have, I'll take that to the stage or conversations like this. That feels better for me. But being customer facing, even when I was in admissions, I would get so tired because I was just talking to students all day long. I still have meetings and stuff that I have to do for my job now, but it's definitely more introvert friendly. And I find that at the end of the day, even after working 8 hours, I still have now energy to go and edit my podcast or songwriting or whatever, because it's just set up in a way that fits my lifestyle and my personality a lot better.
I have seen so many producers post stuff on their social media about if you're not living on pizza and sleeping in your car and walking to your gigs. And it's such a white man thing to glorify the grind and the pain. But I'm like, okay, but if I'm a woman, I'm not sleeping in my car. And there are just things that don't register.
Totally. I saw one of those viral posts. It was like, if you're not writing this many hours a day, or if you're not doing this thing this many hours a day, you're not grinding hard enough. And all the comments from the women in that post were like, so who does your housework? Who does your cooking? Who does all these other things? You probably have a setup where somebody else, your partner, your spouse, is taking care of those things so that you have the privilege and the luxury of just grinding for 12 hours a day. Guess what? At the end of the workday, I still have to make dinner. I still have to do all those things and then sit down and work on the podcast and then sit down and work on music. And it's just the hand that I've been dealt, and I'm okay with that. But that's exactly why I actually started my podcast, because I wanted to start elevating those nuances and those stories and let people out there know that, hey, women of color, first of all, we don't have to take that garbage advice that's out there that doesn't apply to us. And also, we really do have it harder. And that's not to say that we should victimize ourselves and say that, oh my gosh, let's throw ourselves a pity party because we have it harder. But how do we create a space and an environment where we can actually learn and grow together and process those challenges that we have? Because it's so different from the white men who have spouses or whoever to do the other things and take care of the kids. My best friend is a singer and a therapist by day, and she co-hosts my podcast with me, and she has a daughter. So a lot of times we can't even have podcast meetings until her daughter has gone to bed, and we just make it work because that's what we have to do. But you don't see the men talking about that in the advice columns. They're not talking about putting their 2-year-old to bed and then grinding after hours. And I'm not saying that there aren't men out there who have those experiences, because they certainly do. And I have huge amounts of respect for stay-at-home dads or dads who are involved in their their children's lives and all of that. But in a lot of cases, women have these extra challenges that nobody wants to talk about when it comes to career and the grind, so to speak.
Before we let you go, we want to do our rapid fire section.
Okay.
One word or one phrase answers. You don't have to explain, but you can if you want to.
All right.
What was the first language you learned?
Fiji Hindi.
What language do you speak with your parents?
Nowadays, English.
What is a stereotype about your culture that is not true or does not apply to you?
That curry is bad. I hear that a lot. Or I have heard that a lot. And that's not true at all.
What's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
Oh, man. I have to think about that. I'm not a big fan of sushi.
That's fair.
I wish I was. My brothers love it. It's not for me. Yeah.
What's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
Oh man, there are so many. I'm thinking Indian food specifically, but chicken biryani is like my favorite dish. I love it so much. And my mom, I've started to, but my mom is the cook in the family. All of her recipes are amazing. And her biryani specifically is my favorite.
Finally, your favorite Rachel Yamagata song.
Ooh, that's hard. There's so many good ones. I love her whole catalog. I think more recently, so she has a song called Tightrope Walker. There's a line in there that says, focus on where you're going, no matter where you've been. It's just one foot in front of the other. And coming out of all the experiences that I've come out of, especially with my own mental health, that one means a lot to me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Do you want to let our listeners know where they can find you and where they can connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is at jesspillaymusic.com. I've got music out on all the streaming sites and a couple of things on YouTube as well. I always really love plugging my music video for a song called Shine On. Check that out because my friend Stephanie, who is also Asian American, she's this amazing dancer, did this beautiful dance routine for that video. She's very just wants to be in the background, but it's such a well done dance routine. So I love telling people about that.
Thank you so much. It was great chatting with you and finally get to hear your stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Here are our takeaways for today's episode. Number 1, when religion and culture are so intertwined, joining a different religion can be seen as a rejection of your own culture and create family tension. This can prevent kids from enjoying and fully embracing both. Number 2, seeing the very food that got you rejected as a kid be appropriated and become the latest trend is a jarring experience that many Asian Americans have. It's never just food, so give credit where credit is due. Number 3, we're more likely to create change in our own circles where we are already accepted and valued and hence have the most influence. So as Asian Americans, we are best positioned to call out anti-Blackness and patriarchy in our communities. And to our white allies, it's easier for you to call out anti-Asian hate in white communities than it is for us to do so. Number 4, consent is an important part of allyship because it ensures that you're not causing more pain to the very people you are trying to help. Number 5, people's advice reflects their privilege. For example, men aren't expected to do a lot of the day-to-day housekeeping, and they don't have to worry about physical assault as much as women, so their advice reflects that. Another example is people who don't have to worry about their extended family's survival in a new land, they can go all in because in the worst case, they stand to lose alone. Whereas in many immigrant cases, our entire family or community stands to lose if we fail, so the stakes are different. Number 6, valuing your religion and religious community does not mean you have to rely on it entirely for support. It is just one tool in your toolbox. Religious communities often have good intent but are ill-equipped to help people who are dealing with mental health or medical issues. So seek appropriate help from different channels. And finally, therapy and religion can go hand in hand and can actually help people who are going through a faith crisis reconnect with their faith in a more healthy way. I'll leave you now with Telling You the Truth by Jess Pillay. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next week for another nuanced conversation.
You ask me a question. You wanna know where I'm from. So I answer your question, and then I'll watch you come undone. Why does your face look so surprised? share.